Introduction. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. It all happened so quickly that the young woman didn't even understand what was happening to her. Yet she was absolutely sure the road was clear. So sure that she hadn't felt the need to check a second time. There was no reason to, anyway. The dashed lines in the middle of the highway indicated that overtaking was allowed. There was no bend obscuring her view for hundreds of meters ahead. The vehicle she was overtaking wasn't a truck or a bus, just a car. Maybe the only thing she overlooked was the rain. It always made her a little distracted. One way or another, seconds ago, she had accelerated to 140 kilometers per hour and moved into the left lane to overtake the metallic gray Ford Focus in front of her. And by the time she saw the truck speeding toward her, it was already too late. She had less than a fraction of a second to decide what to do. And that was an optimistic estimate. She made her decision. She acted on it. Slowing down to move back behind the car she was overtaking was impossible. Passing between the oncoming truck and the vehicle now directly to her right was also out of the question. Or at least it seemed that way to her. Only two options remained. Collide head-on with the truck and face certain death, or swerve further left and crash into the barriers. If she was lucky, that second option might leave her in a vegetative state rather than killing her. She chose the latter. Better than dying. She didn't open her eyes again until a month later. Even then she was lucky. The doctors hadn't been very hopeful. They had never seen anyone survive an accident like this before. Her physical injuries would heal in time. But the extent of the brain damage, only time would tell. A neurologist came in to examine her and asked for her name. My name is Isla. Isla Kazgan. Good news. She remembered her name. Please try to follow my finger without moving your head. Isla Kazgan, a petite 38-year-old woman, managed to do as the doctor instructed despite the dizziness and pain in her eyes. Very good. Now please rest. What happened to me? You were in a serious car accident. You were very lucky to survive. And I. Dr. Serkan Aaron, a lean and serious-looking man in his 50s, understood what she was about to ask. Every patient in a similar situation asked the same thing. Apart from his overly large nose, he could be considered handsome. Don't worry. Everything is fine. You're going to make a full recovery. By the time Serkan Aaron finished his sentence, Isla Kazgan had already fallen asleep. It was a slightly painful but peaceful sleep. Serkan Aaron stepped out of the intensive care unit and briefed Isla Kazgan's anxious husband, who was waiting outside. Aydin Kazgan, who had been in distress, finally breathed a sigh of relief. The next day, Isla Kazgan underwent a CT scan, an MRI, and an EKG. All results were positive. The young woman was moved out of intensive care and placed in a regular hospital room. A week later, Isla Kazgan had recovered enough to walk on her own and take care of her basic needs. Chapter 1. 3 months later. Aydin Kazgan pointed to the plate in front of his wife and asked, "Do you like it, my love?" "It's wonderful, darling," Isla Kazgan replied. In truth, she didn't like her toast, but she didn't want to spoil the atmosphere of their first breakfast together at home after months. As she looked at her husband, who was still handsome despite having gained a little weight recently, she thought to herself that she had made a lucky marriage. Aydin was a sensible and well-educated man. He had always been by her side through every hardship, through this last incident and before. Aydin Kazgan poured another cup of tea for both his wife and himself, then glanced at his watch. At that very moment the doorbell rang. Isla made a move to get up, but Aydin gestured for her to stay seated. "I'll get it, sweetheart. You don't need to get up." "All right then." They both already knew who was at the door. Aydin Kazgan opened it. "Welcome, Mom." "How are you?" he said, kissing his mother-in-law formally. I'm fine," said Emin Guler, a woman who looked to be in her mid-70s as she stepped inside. "Looks like breakfast isn't over yet. It's nice to see you like this," she added, glancing at her daughter still eating. She adjusted her white hair with her hands. Mother and daughter hugged and kissed. Despite their insistence, Emin Guler refused to eat anything, claiming she had stuffed herself before leaving home. "I'll leave you ladies to it," Aydin Kazgan said. "If I don't leave now, I'll be late." Aydin worked as an engineer at a private software company on the Asian side of the city. "All right, sweetheart," Isla said. "Don't be late this evening. Call me immediately if anything happens." "Don't worry, nothing will happen," Emin Guler said with a smile. Aydin coughed first, then put on his shoes. After clumsily adjusting his slightly sagging pants, he left the house. Mother and daughter exchanged smiles. They chatted about everyday things, the weather, the latest news. Dr. Semi, who had been in charge of Isla's treatment, was such a charming man, but the hospital's equipment was outdated, especially the EKG machines. And the new doctors who had just started working there, so unfriendly. Doctors these days just weren't like they used to be. Did Nurkin tell you anything? Isla suddenly asked her mother. I mean, about work? Isla worked at a gallery in Nisantasy called Galerie Lumière, where she took on different roles as a teacher, artist, and curator. Nurkin was her closest friend at work. Her mother smiled, understanding what she meant. You don't need to worry, sweetheart. You know Nurkin visited you often while you were unconscious. She kept your boss updated regularly. You just focus on getting better. You can return to work when you're ready. Isla felt relieved. Then another thought crossed her mind. She hadn't dared to ask Aydin about it. Has Aydin said anything about the car? Oh, come on, don't be silly. Look at him, he's been running around taking care of you. He was beside himself while you were in the hospital. He hasn't even mentioned the car. The insurance covered it right away. He got a new one a month after the accident. I know, but he must have had to put in some money on top, right? He should at least do that much, said Emin Guler and kissed her daughter as if she were a little child. So everything was fine. The dark days were behind them and everything would go back to the way it was. Then what was wrong? Where did this unease that Isla couldn't quite name come from? Around 7 in the evening, as Emin Hanım dozed off in front of the television and Isla Kazgan distracted herself with her phone, they heard Aydin unlocking the door and stepping inside. Emin Guler coughed as if to say, I wasn't sleeping. Isla lifted her head without putting down her phone and smiled at her husband. Welcome home, my love. How was your day? Hello, dear, thank you. Hello, Mom, how are you? Before Emin Guler had a chance to greet her son-in-law, Isla realized the reason for her unease. Aydin, where is Tolga? Didn't you pick him up from school? Aydin Kazgan and Emin Guler were stunned. After a few seconds of silence, Emin was the first to speak. Sweetheart, who are you talking about? Who is Tolga? Yes, darling, who is this Tolga? Aydin Kazgan repeated the question. Isla looked from her mother to her husband as if asking, Are you messing with me? She couldn't find anything to say. Aydin Kazgan pressed on. Isla? Answer me. Who is Tolga? What school are you talking about? Asterisk. No one could find anything to say for a long while. They just stared at each other in confusion. Tolga Kazgan was the 9-year-old son of Isla and Aydin Kazgan. He was in the 3rd grade of elementary school. After the accident, while Isla was unconscious in the hospital, Aydin Kazgan and Emin Guler had acted wisely and not allowed the child to see his mother. Once Isla began to recover, they had limited her interactions with Tolga to minimize the emotional impact on him. It was also important that Isla didn't overexert herself. During this period, Tolga had stayed at his grandmother's house, and since no school bus passed near Emin Guler's home, his father had been taking him to and from school. The previous day they had finally agreed that Tolga could return home. And now her mother and husband stood before her, seriously asking, Who is Tolga? What kind of joke was this? Isla finally managed to speak. Come on, what do you mean? What do you mean, who is Tolga? You're joking, right? Sweetheart, you're scaring me. Are you okay? Said Emin Guler, looking confused. Isla, this is not the time for jokes. You're freaking us out, said Aydin Kazgan. Apparently no one was joking. And apparently there was a serious problem. For Aydin Kazgan and Emin Guler, there was only one logical explanation. Aydin, seeing that Isla had jumped to her feet, tried to calm her down. Elasicim, please try to stay calm. Look, you're upsetting my mother too. Why don't you lie down for a bit? Serkan Bey warned us that some confusion like this might happen for a while. You've been through a lot, but we're here for you. Don't be afraid. My dear daughter, come here, let me hug my baby, said Emin Hanım. Isla protested, shouting and resisting. But only briefly. There was no point in prolonging it. She hugged and kissed her mother. I guess you're right. I'm sorry. I feel better now. I must have just been confused. Are you sure, sweetheart? Do you want to see a doctor? No need, Mom. Don't worry. I'm sure it will all be gone once I sleep tonight. As you wish, dear, said Emin Guler, her eyes filled with concern. Aydin Kazgan just watched. Then he embraced his wife. It's okay, my love. There's nothing to worry about. Everything will be fine. An hour later, life had returned to normal. 2 hours later, when they were convinced that Isla was fine, Aydin Kazgan and his mother-in-law left the house. Aydin was going to drop her off at her home in Sarıyer. Isla had insisted on staying home. Aydin settled into the driver's seat of his white Passat, parked across the street. Emin Guler sat beside him. Before starting the car, Aydin turned to look at the woman sitting next to him. He stared at her for a long time. She stared back. How much do you think she really understands? I'm not sure, the woman replied. Then the car started moving. As soon as her husband and mother left, Isla rushed to the back room to find her son's belongings. Who do they think they're fooling? What the hell is going on here? What did you do to my son? She believed she had been smart to act as if she believed everything her mother and husband had said. She was going to find her son. No matter what. And, of course, she was going to find out what the hell Aydin and her mother were up to. That is, if they really were her husband and mother. Her mother's house wasn't far. Even with Istanbul traffic, Aydin would be home in at most an hour and a half. She had to hurry. She found nothing. 4 months ago, where her son's room used to be, now there was a living room decorated with entirely different furniture. And there was no trace of Tolga, neither in this room nor anywhere else in the house. No clothes, no toys, no photographs or anything else. What happened to my son? What did they do to him? She looked at her watch. Aydin would be arriving soon. Despite the storm raging inside her, she knew she had to keep her nerves in check. Her son's life was at stake. She would solve this without anyone noticing. She heard the door open. Welcome, my love. Hello, darling, I left my mom and came straight back. You're okay, aren't you? Of course I'm fine. Why wouldn't I be? She hugged her husband. Chapter 2. The next morning, she called her mother to tell her that she was feeling fine and was going out. There was no need for Emin Guler to come. Although the old woman objected, Ayla Kazgan persuaded her mother with pleading. She also convinced her husband. Right after Aydin Kazgan left the house, uneasy about going to work, Ayla took her phone and called Nurkan. Hello? Nurkan? Hi, darling. Yes, I'm perfectly fine, don't worry. If you're free today, shall we meet? No. I won't come to your workplace. No, you don't need to pick me up, I'll come. Where? Okay, darling, I kissed you. See you. 2 hours later, Ayla and Nurkan were chatting at the Red Cup Cafe in Nisantasi. My darling, I'm so happy to see you feeling better. I've been thinking about you for days, but I couldn't find a chance to visit again with all the work. You scared us. Honestly, you weren't in a very good condition at the hospital, said Nurkan before taking a big sip of her coffee. She was a red-haired, slightly chubby, medium-height woman who spoke as if her motor was on. I missed you too. I missed going out as well. So, tell me, what have you been up to? Come on, what should I talk about? The usual annoying stuff. The real news is with you. You've been through a lot. What does your doctor say? When are you going back to work? It won't take too long. I won't bore you with the details of my condition, but let's just say I was lucky. Actually, I could go back to the gallery immediately, but Mr. Sirkin says I need to rest at home for another 15 days. Is your doctor at least single? Nurkan asked, chuckling. At the same time, she was eyeing a large man who had just entered the cafe. The two friends continued to talk about trivial matters for another half hour. Then Ayla suddenly grew serious and steered the conversation in the direction she wanted. Nurkan. I need to ask you something, but I'm afraid you'll think I've gone crazy from all the blows I've taken. Nurkan also became serious. She looked carefully at her friend's face. The room fell silent for a few seconds. Then, trying to regain her usual cheerful demeanor in a slightly fake way, she said, Ask away, darling. Aren't we all a little crazy anyway? Sophie, do you think, my mom and Aydin, how should I put it? Could they have a reason to hide Tolga from me? Nurkan stared at her friend's face for a while, looking shocked. At the same time, she was absent-mindedly playing with the empty coffee cup on the table. Finally, the words escaped her mouth. Ayla, which Tolga are you talking about, darling? Before leaving the cafe, Ayla had to fight hard not to lash out at Nurkan. You lowlife. So, you don't know Tolga, huh? What are you after? What did you do to my son? She walked through the crowded streets for a while, her head spinning with anger. She hadn't fully recovered physically yet. To top it off, she sat down on a bench. She tried to collect her thoughts. She had to calm down. She took deep breaths. She looked at her watch. She tried to decide what her next move would be. She made a decision. By late afternoon, Ayla was at Nilofer Hatton Primary School before the workday ended. At the school her son attended. She went up to the floor where Tolga's class was. Ignoring the strange looks directed at her in the corridor, she patiently waited for the bell to signal the end of the lesson. Finally, the children came out of class. Tolga's classmates. She tapped the already open classroom door out of formality. She leaned her head inside. Mr. Ahmet was tidying his desk, preparing to leave. When he saw her, he turned and said, Yes? What can I do for you? In a tired tone. Hello, Mr. Ahmet, how are you? I'm fine, thank you. How can I help you? Said Mr. Ahmet, his voice sounding as if asking, who are you and what do you want at this hour? I'm Ayla Kazgan, Tolga's mother. I'm sure you remember me. I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour, but I need to ask something important. I won't take up much of your time. The man stared blankly. He was absolutely certain he had never seen this woman before, and that he didn't have a student named Tolga. I'm sorry I couldn't place you. None of my students are named Tolga, but please come in and have a seat. I'll go get something to drink from the canteen and be right back. But I'm sure this is just a simple misunderstanding. Please calm down, I'll be back in 5 minutes. Before Ayla could say anything, Mr. Ahmet left. Ayla did as he suggested. She sat down in one of the front rows and tried to gather her thoughts. She really needed to do so. After waiting for 15 minutes and realizing the man hadn't appeared, Ayla understood what was going on. She quietly approached the door of the classroom. She slowly opened it. She looked to the right of the corridor. No one was there. Then she turned to the other side. And at that moment she noticed Mr. Ahmet, accompanied by 2 security guards, approaching her at a fast pace. You scumbag. She quickly turned and started running in the opposite direction. She hoped the men behind her hadn't taken the matter seriously enough to follow her for long. She also hoped there would be stairs leading down in the direction she was heading. There were. When she thought she was far enough from the school, she stopped. She was out of breath. Her vision was blurry, her head was spinning, her knees were trembling, and she felt nauseous. She stumbled into the first kiosk she saw. She bought a simit, tea and water. She drank half of the half-liter water bottle in one go. She dropped half a sugar cube into her tea. As she stirred the sugar, she tried to make sense of what had happened. It didn't work. She felt utterly helpless and weak. All the memories of her son were vivid. His scent, the tone of his voice, his appearance, everything they had shared over 9 years. On the other hand, her mother and husband, as well as her friends and the teacher, were all so sure of the situation. There was no child named Tolga. There had never been one. Could they be right? For the first time she began to doubt herself. Maybe, as her mother and Aydin had said, all of this was just a trick her brain was playing on her due to the blows she had taken in the accident. Or maybe, she was losing her mind. She drank half of her tea. She didn't touch the simit. She left the kiosk to head home. Chapter 3. Ayla had been afraid of enclosed spaces since childhood. That's why, whenever she heard the word MRI, her skin would crawl. Fortunately, in recent years, modern hospitals had replaced the old coffin-like MRI machines with open devices. On the Wednesday morning, which marked the 2nd week since her discharge from the hospital, Ayla had another brain CT scan and MRI. They waited over 3 hours for the results in the crowded hospital. At 2 p.m. Ayla Kazgan, along with her mother and husband, was in Dr. Serkan narrow, cramped yet well-lit office. The results are clean, said Serkan, gesturing to the reports on his desk. Then, he handed the papers to Aydin Kazgan as if to say, please take a look as well, and continued, there's no pathology in your brain that would explain what you've been through, Mrs. Ayla. Physically, you're surprisingly healthy given the severity of the accident. The only thing I can do is refer you to a psychiatrist friend of mine. Of course, only if you'd like. Ayla looked at her husband and mother. From their facial expressions, she understood that the decision was left up to her. After a few seconds of hesitation, she said, I don't want to decide right now, but you can give me your friend's number in case I need to reach out later. She would tell her mother and husband that she wasn't ready to visit a psychiatrist yet. It would take quite a bit of convincing to persuade her family, who didn't entirely approve of this decision, that she was doing better. She would have to convince herself as well. Are you sure you're in a condition to work, darling? Yes, honey, don't worry. I need to leave everything behind and get back to my daily routine. I promise this will be good for me. I've already told Nurkin that I'll be back today. Aydin Kazgan took the last sip from his tea and placed the cup on the table. He stared absent-mindedly out of the window. It was a bright day. For the first time in a long while, his wife had prepared breakfast. Taking his gaze away from the window, he turned toward his wife. He tried to gauge how clear her mind was by observing her posture and facial expression rather than just listening to her words. She looked good, but he wasn't entirely sure. At least let me drop you off at work? Ayla smiled and, as she stood up to clear the breakfast table, said, Of course, darling, why not? An hour later, the white Volkswagen Passat stopped in front of the art gallery. Are you sure you don't want me to come in with you or wait here for a while, my love? Ayla Kazgan kissed her husband on the cheek. You're exaggerating, darling. I'm fine, don't worry. She opened the car door, got out and shut it behind her. She waved exaggeratedly as if to say, "Go on now," to her husband. Then she turned around and started walking toward the gallery entrance. A minute later she was inside. Gallery Lumiere was one of the prestigious and established art centers in Nisantasy. The gallery had a spacious, brightly lit interior designed in a minimalist and modern style. In the main exhibition area on the ground floor, oil paintings, sculptures, and other modern works were placed in accordance with the building's natural lighting. The reception and consultation area, along with storage rooms and offices, were also located on the ground floor. The upper floor housed private collection rooms. Nurkin greeted her friend immediately at the entrance. They chatted casually for a while. Then Nurkin couldn't resist and asked, "You scared me the other day at the cafe, honey? I didn't understand what happened. You mentioned Tolga and then you suddenly got up and left. Are you okay now?" Isla smiled slightly. "I'm a bit embarrassed, please don't take it the wrong way. I'm fine, don't worry. How can I explain? I experienced some confusion after the accident." "Oh, come on, stop overthinking, just be okay," Nurkin replied. While continuing their conversation, they began walking slowly through the middle of the exhibition hall toward the back, where the offices were located. As they passed by the oil paintings, Isla noticed something was off, as if something was not right. But how could this be? She needed to look closer to be sure. But Nurkin was talking nonstop. It was better not to draw attention after the unpleasant incident last week. She would deal with it after getting rid of Nurkin. As they neared the office area, Isla noticed a large, pale-faced security guard approaching them. The woman, adjusting her fallen pants and walking with unsteady steps, was no stranger. Kanan Gurul, a cheerful woman in her 40s, had been working there for a long time and was loved by everyone. "Welcome, my dear," she said with a sincere expression. "I'm so happy you're better," she said and hugged her colleague without hesitation. Isla was taken aback. As far as she remembered, there hadn't been such familiarity between her and Kanan. They didn't even address each other in a familiar manner. She tried to respond as warmly as possible, forcing herself. Of course, she didn't hug Kanan as tightly as she had, but she lightly patted the back of the woman who was twice her size. "Thank you, Kanan," Isla said, managing to slip away from the woman's arms immediately after. "Honestly, you look amazing, even better than me," Kanan said in her usual clumsy but affectionate manner. "We'll have a long talk next time we sit down," she added, looking at her watch. "But I really need to leave now, your uniform is in its usual spot." "Excuse me, much love," she said, adding a kiss. Just as Kanan was about to turn and leave, Isla stopped her by grabbing her shoulder. "Wait a second. Which uniform are you talking about?" she asked as if to challenge her. Asterisk. It was clear from Kanan's gaze that she didn't fully understand the question. Nurkin's gaze also reflected the same confusion. When Kanan didn't respond, Isla repeated her question in an aggressive tone. "I said, which uniform are you talking about?" She had asked the question to Kanan, but she was looking more at Nurkin. She was waiting for the response, "Oh, don't worry, she's just talking nonsense, what uniform?" from Nurkin. Instead, Nurkin looked at Kanan and gestured with her hands as if to say, "Calm down, there's nothing wrong, she's just sick." Then she turned to her friend. "Isla, it's okay, calm down, there's nothing to worry about. Rest a bit. If you're not feeling well, you can start working in a few days," she said. "It's your work uniform, what else could it be?" Kanan chimed in, gaining courage from Nurkin. "And your gun is locked in its usual spot." Unable to make sense of what was happening, Isla clenched her fists and looked from Nurkin to Kanan. "What are you talking about? What does my gun and uniform have to do with anything?" "I'm an artist," she shouted. When she saw the pity in her friend's eyes, her world crumbled again. Nurkin, in a soft voice, was able to say, "Isla, you're working here as a security guard." "No. Why are you doing this to me? Come with me. I'll prove who I am to you." Kanan was caught in a dilemma. Her duty was to intervene to protect the gallery's reputation and security. On the other hand, the person she needed to intervene with was a close friend who had recently come close to death. Nurkin was in the same situation. She looked around and the gallery was empty. There usually weren't any visitors at this time of day. For now, she decided to go along with her friend's request, hoping she would calm down. Isla grabbed Nurkin's arm and led her to the area where the oil paintings were displayed a few meters away. Kanan followed them. "Look," Isla said, pointing to a large oil painting in an abstract expressionist style. "This is one of my recent works. It's been exhibited here since September of last year." After saying this, she looked directly into her friend's eyes. She was faced with the reality that the pity and sadness in Nurkin's gaze had intensified. Nurkin knew her friend wasn't well. So did Kanan. Isla was normally a level-headed woman. She had known her for years. This situation was somehow related to the car accident. But how? Physically, she had almost fully recovered. Neurological damage didn't show up in the tests either. But the situation was clear. She was claiming the existence of a child she had never had, and that she was an artist, not a security guard. And she was blaming her loved ones for speaking the truth. Let's see what else she would do. Poor thing, look what happened to her. I hope she recovers. You didn't paint that picture, Isla, Nurkin said, fearfully pointing at the signature in the lower right corner of the painting. The signature belonged to the famous Irish artist Helen Mitchell. Isla collapsed to her knees. She covered her face with her hands and started crying uncontrollably. For now, I'm not considering hospitalization, said Dr. Kenan Toksoy, first looking at Aydin Kazgin, then Emin Guler and finally Isla. He adjusted his glasses once again, pushing them up with the index finger of his left hand as they kept sliding down his nose. Isla had drifted into the strange painting hanging on the wide wall of the examination room. It was Metamorphosis by the genius artist M.C. Escher. The doctor ran his hand over his slightly balding head and continued speaking. It's a complicated picture, to be honest. There are psychotic symptoms, but I personally don't think this is the onset of schizophrenia. Considering that Isla has never had any mental health issues before and that all the symptoms started after the car accident. But for now, I can't say anything definite. He wrote down a prescription in front of him. An antipsychotic, an antiepileptic, and a sedative. Handing the paper to Aydin Kazgin, he said with a serious expression. We'll stay in contact with Mr. Sirkin. Once Isla calms down a bit, we will reassess her condition and start therapy. When they returned home, Isla fell into a deep sleep under the effect of the psychiatrist's prescribed medication. Chapter 4. The next day when she woke up, it was almost evening. It looked like she had slept for more than 15 hours. She barely managed to open her eyes. Her mind was a mess. She needed time to remember where she was and what day it was. Her mouth was completely dry. Her hands were trembling and her head was spinning. She got up. She took a shower, got dressed, and did her best to pull herself together. What is happening to me? Before leaving the bathroom, she realized she didn't know who was at home at that moment. There were some sounds coming from the kitchen. She hesitated as she walked toward it. She felt as if she were not in her own house but in a stranger's home. She opened the door. Her mother was inside, preparing something to eat. When she noticed her daughter, Emin Hanım smiled. It was a worried smile. Are you awake, dear? How are you? Did you get some rest? Yes. I was just preparing dinner. Have a seat if you'd like. Do you need anything? A glass of water. But I'll get it myself, you go ahead with what you're doing. All right, baby, whatever you prefer. Isla filled half of a large glass with water and drank it. After placing the glass on the table, she pulled a chair near the kitchen window facing the street and sat down. Staring blankly outside, she asked her mother in a dull voice. What did you do today? The usual, dear. Oh, by the way, Nurkin called. She asked how you were. She was really worried about you. She and Kanan are planning to visit you sometime. That's kind of her. I made your favorite chicken dish, Isla. Do you want anything else? No. Knowing that her daughter wouldn't be very talkative these days, Emin Guler continued preparing dinner. She occasionally glanced at Isla, who was staring outside as if she had turned to stone. An hour later, the mother and daughter moved to the living room. Emin Guler turned on the TV. Within a minute, she turned it off again. There was nothing on that would be good for Isla. Around 7:30, the doorbell rang. I'll get it, Emin Guler said quickly, as if Isla would have answered if she hadn't spoken first. Isla showed no reaction. 10 seconds later, when Emin opened the door, she saw her son-in-law standing there with shopping bags in his hands. Beside him stood a small, frail-looking old man with thinning white hair, appearing to be around 80 years old. She invited them inside. Isla listened as her mother, husband, and the unfamiliar old man whispered in the hallway. She couldn't make out every word, but she could understand enough to know they were talking about her health. How is she now? Not too bad. What did the doctor say? When is it? As their conversation at the doorway dragged on, Isla stood up. Her curiosity about the old man grew. Who could he be and why would he visit at this hour? Before she could step out of the living room, her mother, husband, and the elderly man entered the room. The small old man smiled and said, You're feeling better now, aren't you, my dear? Your mother told me you slept very well last night. Isla first looked at her mother, then at Aydin as if to say, Who is this man? Carefully avoiding eye contact with the elderly man. "What's wrong, my dear? Won't you answer me?" the old man asked. This time Isla spoke directly. "Who is this man, Mom?" Her question shocked everyone. A long silence followed, filled with exchanged glances. It was not Emin Guler who answered, but the old man himself. You really don't recognize me, my dear?" "My dear?" That was absolutely impossible. Isla's father had passed away from a heart attack 10 years ago at the age of 70. Besides, this man didn't even resemble her father. This time Isla reacted differently. She wasn't aggressive. She wasn't accusatory. But she wasn't accepting either. She was not insane. Months ago she had been in a car accident. A car accident could kill a person, injure them, or leave them disabled. But it couldn't cause this. And whatever was happening now, it wasn't that either. On the other hand, it made no sense to think that her mother, her husband, her friends, or the doctors were conspiring against her. That left only one possibility. The one she had no choice but to accept, no matter how difficult it was. She didn't say a word. She didn't look at anyone with pleading eyes. She didn't sit down and cry. She simply walked past her mother, her husband, and the so-called father standing in the middle of the living room. She put on her coat, slipped on her boots, and walked out of the house. As she hurried down the stairs, she slowed down once or twice to glance back. No one was following her. No one was trying to stop her. If what she was thinking was true, that was perfectly normal. She burst through the apartment's entrance. As she ran across the street, she searched her coat pockets. The spare keys to their car were still with her. She spotted the white Passat her husband had just parked. She unlocked the door and got inside. Chapter 5. As she moved, she instinctively knew where she was heading. She pressed the gas pedal, increasing her speed. The roads were surprisingly empty. Almost deserted. At this hour, such a thing was nearly impossible in Istanbul. But Isla wasn't surprised. Nor was she startled by the sudden fog that had rolled in. She connected from Valikanagi Avenue to Bayakdere Avenue, heading toward Zincirlikuyu. Following the signs for the Fatih Sultan Mehmet Bridge, she passed through Levent and turned toward Ediler Besiktas. She followed Nispatay Avenue down to Bebek. From Bebek, she took the coastal road toward Rumeli Castle. Knowing in advance that she wouldn't find a suitable parking spot near the fortress, she parked near Bebek Mosque and got out of the car. In the cold and foggy night, she ran the 500-meter distance, her breath visible in the air. Normally, at this hour, the entrance to the fortress would be closed to visitors. Yet Isla wasn't surprised when she saw the main gate wide open, as if saying, "Come on in, I'm waiting for you." That was exactly what she had expected. She stepped inside and climbed the stairs. She had no difficulty finding the entrance to Saruka Pasa Tower, the tallest of Rumeli Hisari's 3 great towers. She started ascending. A few minutes later, when she reached the top of the 80-meter-high tower, she was breathless. Her lungs burned from the cold, her head spun, and her knees felt weak. The moment of confrontation had arrived. If you dream of dying, you wake up. That was something everyone knew. But if you were trapped in a dream from which you couldn't wake up, the only way to escape was to kill yourself. That was what Isla was thinking. But what if this wasn't a dream? She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the edge of the tower. But what if this was a dream, and what awaited me when I woke up was even worse than this nightmare? She gazed at the magnificent sea view. She could see the Fatih Sultan Mehmet Bridge, Anadolu Hisari, Bebek, and the Arnavutköy coastline. For a moment, the beauty of the scenery confused her. What if I'm wrong? She looked again. No, she wasn't wrong. Something was off. There wasn't a single person in all of Istanbul. She wasn't in the real world. She had no idea who or what had trapped her in this artificial reality, or why and how it had happened, but she refused to live a lie. She let herself fall from the top of the 80-meter-high tower. The fall should have lasted only a few seconds. Just a few seconds to escape the nightmare that had haunted her for months. She realized it was taking longer than expected. It felt as if she had jumped not from an 80-meter tower but from an airplane thousands of meters high. Or maybe, just as she was about to hit the ground, the earth split apart, extending the distance she had to fall over and over again. As she drifted through the void, she heard a voice. At first it was muffled. She couldn't tell who or what it belonged to, nor what it was saying. Then it became clearer. The voice sounded like, "Tolga. Mom, I failed." As she floated in the emptiness, her son reached out and grabbed her arm. But that's impossible. Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to embrace him. She couldn't. His flesh and blood body first turned into something ghostly like a hologram, then slowly disappeared completely. "No, don't go. Tell me, what did you fail at?" Tolga didn't answer. Nor did he reappear. Isla looked down. She was nearing the ground. In just a few seconds she would either die or wake up from the nightmare. The second option happened. She struggled to open her eyes inside the wreckage of her shattered car. The first thing she saw was a young man in uniform, reaching through the broken windshield to pull her out. "Is the woman alive?" asked another officer in the same uniform, an older man who was checking on a boy in the back seat who looked about 10 years old. "Yes, she's badly injured, but she'll probably survive." "What about the child?" "I'm afraid he's already gone." The end.